Hello again, your friendly neighborhood ed services team here. This time we want to talk a little bit about the Guaranteed and Viable Curriculum, or GVC, Acceleration Project. So first of all, we're so thankful that all of you joined us. You've been selected for this project because you are a content level expert and also a leader in terms of instructional strategies in our district. So we're super grateful for your expertise and that you're joining us for this project. Basically, this is going to be one of 3 short videos that is going to train and prepare you for this project, the Guaranteed and Viable Curriculum Project. If at any point you want to stop or slow down any of these videos, feel free to do that. Feel free to rewind. Also, the entire presentation is up here, and you'll see this link in the corner of all the slides, bit.ly/GVC accelerated. Keep in mind that bit.ly is case sensitive, so you will need to have the proper case there. So our objectives for today and for this work in general are to review the background and context for this work that we're doing, create a common vocabulary for this work so that when we say something like essential standard, we all mean the same thing. And then with the work itself, to make progress on our content GVC for the good of all of our students. So this will consist of 3 different components. The training, which I said, again, is 3 short videos. We're going to talk about the purpose of the Guaranteed and Viable Curriculum work in the first training video. And then we're going to do a couple mini training videos on how we select essential standards and how you unpack essential standards. Then, after you've watched these 3 videos, you're going to meet with your content-specific specialist or facilitator so they can answer any questions. And then you're just going to have work time. So you're going to be selecting essential standards, you're going to be unpacking those standards, and then consolidating that work and working on next steps for Summer PD Academy. So the big question that comes up is, why are we having these work sessions, and why don't we wait for Summer PD Academy? Great question. And we really wanted to make sure we were grounded in our why before we did this. Our big why for this is we know that best practice in terms of grading and assessment is to be standards aligned, but it's really hard to actually align our grading practices and our assessments to standards if our curriculum and our instruction aren't aligned to standards. So we know that the biggest chunk of that work is creating a guaranteed and viable curriculum so that all students get the same standards-based instruction regardless of teacher. So we know that we have a lot of real work to do, so we hear you on that. We know that some schools, some teams, some individuals are going full standards-based grading in the fall. And in order to do that, we really want to ensure that our guaranteed and viable curriculum is tightened up. So we pushed a few extra hours at this work before we actually start Summer PD Academy so that we can get further along in this process before next fall. So we're going to talk a few key terms and just make sure that when we're talking about essential standards and learning targets and things like that, that we're all on the same page. Okay, so first clarification is the learning target versus standard. So, learning or goal targets are statements of knowledge and skills students need to demonstrate mastery of a standard. This can be anything from a standard itself to one component of a standard that's been broken down. And we'll talk about the differences between a few of these. Standards are the state or nationwide statements of knowledge and skills students need. So some might be usable for learning targets as is, and some might be needed to be broken down into learning targets. For example, if we take the course Honors Anatomy and Physiology, almost all of the things that are essential content in that fall underneath one standard. So that standard has to be broken up into a bunch of student-friendly learning targets so that students and teachers and parents and all stakeholders can be on the same page in terms of what they need to work on and what they've already mastered. So when we're talking about our curriculum work, all of our curriculum documents, pacing guides, teacher support, etc., are made up of basically 2 different categories of standards: essential standards and supporting standards. Essential standards, which we'll define more in a minute, are these standards that we see as critical for every single student in that class. The supporting standards are pieces that either support the essential standards or we see as critical for the work, but maybe not something that every single student has to master. Maybe they're just a good supporting piece, or they are like good additional knowledge for students to know, but they're not like deal-breaking essentials. And again, we'll talk more about what it means to be essential. The bulk of our work is going to be focused on this. So once we have selected our essential standards, we do one of three things. We either leave the standard as is and just simply rewrite it in student-friendly language. So these are the essential standards that can serve as a learning target on their own. These are generally less complex standards. And I'll show you an example of a couple different standards so you can see the difference. Some of our essential standards are really dense and bulky, and they're going to need to be divided up into learning targets. So essential learning targets are the ones that come from these essential standards. They still measure mastery and they still measure at the same level of proficiency as at the standard. They just chunk up that content a little bit differently and into smaller pieces. So we keep the depth of knowledge, the proficiency level the same, but we chunk up the content into smaller learning targets. For both essential and supporting standards, we'll also have supporting learning targets. And these supporting learning targets are basically anything additional that we think helps students get to these essential standards or learning targets, but may not be at the full level of mastery that students need to be at. So in order to solve a linear equation, students need to be able to do some small skills before that, but we don't say that they've mastered solving linear equations by being able to add and subtract. It's just a skill that you get to before you do that. So here's a couple of different examples. The first example that we're going to look at is this math example. Rearrange formulas to highlight a quantity of interest using the same reasoning as in solving equations. So this is the standard right here. This standard is just fine as it is. All it needs to be done here is it needs to be written in student-friendly language, because that in itself is a level of understanding and an easy enough piece to assess that it can be left alone. So we just rearrange it into student-friendly language. I can rearrange a formula to highlight a quantity of interest. Perfect, we're good to go there. So that hits on this essential standards as learning targets. We can leave that standard essentially as is. Now, for this standard, which is up here in the blue, in the green, develop and use models to explain the relationship of the structure of atoms and to patterns and properties observed within the periodic table and describe how these models are revised with new evidence. You can see that that standard is a lot more bulky than that math standard, right? It's measuring a couple of different things. So we're going to break that down into some learning targets that, again, are still at the same level of mastery as the standard, but they take different chunks of content. So this one, you can explain modern atomic theory by modeling compounds of the atom, periodic table, and then systems of organization around the periodic table. So it's taking the content there and chunking it down so that when I'm looking as a student or as a teacher or as a parent, I can see in the gradebook which components of this you have mastered and which you're still struggling with, instead of this huge, bulky, big standard. Now, you'll also see over here some some supporting learning targets, which are not necessarily at the level of mastery that you see over here, but these help to support these essential learning targets. So developing the model of an adult based on modern atomic theory, right? So you're building this model first, you're revising that model. Neither of those lead you to a full state of mastery, but those are skills that lead you to this essential learning target, which proves mastery. So again, that's what we're talking about when we say essential learning targets, and an essential standard being broken down into essential learning targets. If you have any questions about this first part, which is, again, all you have to go to is bit.ly/GVC Accelerated in order to look at this presentation. Please feel free to ask these during your content debrief. reach out to your content specialist or facilitator, or email edservices@aguafria.org in order to get your questions answered. We will also be attaching a list of resources into this presentation that you can access, which will help you with some of these skills. Thank you.